Okay, how's it going, everyone? So my name is Bob Lee III, and I want to welcome you to Track One. I know a lot of you that were probably here from Randall's keynote, but I kind of want to just take a second in order to officially welcome you to the start of Track One here. And I know I'm the first one speaking here, so obviously I'm trying not to think too much about the pressure that's behind that. So I'm just hoping in order to be able to kick off this track in the most positive light and really to continue your day with just like a lot of learning here and a lot of knowledge sharing. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started with my presentation, which is called Breaking Down That AWS Silo. And we're going to start today with a very familiar story. So I'm sure I'm not the only one on this webinar that started my AWS journey or started your AWS journey working for a company that generally had all their infrastructure on premise. It's really not crazy in order to say that, because cloud technologies, especially in the tech space, are relatively new. Even when it comes to AWS, the first services meaning S3, EC2, and SQS were all released in 2006. And because there's a ton of other companies that are out there that were founded prior to 2006, I'm sure that assumption is pretty correct, where a big chunk of you or a lot of you either have worked for a company that started their that had a lot of their infrastructure on premise and then started moving towards AWS. The tech team structure in an organization like that probably looks somewhat similar to this, and I'm sure this looks very similar to a lot that are out there. With the tech team structure like this, the engineers really have very well-defined roles, generally speaking, that is. So everyone with this kind of like older structure really knows like what they're responsible for and what the teams are responsible for. So for example, the software engineers are generally writing application code. Network engineers are working on on-prem Cisco devices and network routing. Security engineers, observability, so on and so forth. Those roles were really well defined, and for a long time, within a company that had on-prem infrastructure, all that made sense. Nobody really had many questions on who supported what. But then that goes into my own personal experience here, and I'm sure again for a lot of you, the inevitable happens. That management starts in order to hear more and more benefits about the public cloud and AWS. So generally, managers will hear chatter from their engineers that work for them, or for other or from other managers that they might be working with. That they hear, hey, we have this upcoming project, and we actually needed it done yesterday, and we don't have the time in order to actually spin up on-prem VMs. We don't have time in order to maybe order that extra server that we might need to have racked and mounted and wired. So let's move it to the cloud. It's going to save us money, and this project is not going to be that big, right? We only need a couple EC2 instances, and we need an S3 bucket. So it's really not that big of a deal, right? Well, so even with a project like that, you still need to have architecture involved in some way in order to provision, even at this point, that small AWS footprint. So when it comes to that decision, generally, at least in my experience, the decision is kind of made like this, where whoever is running the project might look at their IT organization and they might say, eeny, meeny, miny, mo, and just kind of pick one. Generally a team is chosen for this that really has like broad technical background and has the ability in order to kind of figure out new technologies. But because again, this project is really hot, it needs to be done right now, and we need a single point of contact for architectures. Generally one team is chosen, and then that team is basically carries everything out, architects all the cloud infrastructure, and then goes on from there. So once that project then kind of wraps up, you know, the company now has a small AWS footprint that one original team has provisioned, and everything is working as expected, and then profit. So the company then realizes, hey, you know, we were able to spin up, you know, this brand new architecture, this brand new service very, very quickly. We just had one architecture team that was actually, you know, monitoring this and rolling it out, and it seemed super easy, right? So then when the next project rolls around, then AWS or a cloud, you know, like a cloud technology is actually on management's mind. So they'll suggest that, and that goes to that original team. And the next one, same thing, will go to that original team, and the same thing. So then you start to turn into your updated team responsibilities might look something like this. So prior to your IT's organization's responsibilities, is what we were talking about before, being very well defined. Now you have a single team that owns EC2, RDS, S3, SNS, SQS, Lambda, VPC, Elasticsearch, SageMaker, KMS, ECR, Fargate, and EKS. Oh yeah, and all of that other on-premise stuff. Like I said, this really comes from our you know, my own personal experience in this industry, and like I said, this at this point now you kind of have the dreaded technical issue of having a silo within your organization. So before I start getting into kind of the meat and bones of my presentation here and talking about how to break down that pesky silo, I just wanted to give everybody a pro tip. So if you are just kind of starting your company's AWS journey, or if you still have a fairly small AWS footprint right now, I would heavily recommend from a pro tip here, in order to collaborate early. And what I mean by that is, if you need an RDS instance or an Aurora instance spun up in the cloud, get your DBAs involved as you're setting up your direct connect gateways. If you have a hybrid environment, get your network engineers involved. From the get-go, get your security engineers involved in order to help out with security group, security scans, and so on. Because if you don't have everybody kind of working in tandem, you will eventually kind of build up that silo where there's really one team that kind of knows everything regarding the AWS infrastructure of your company, and that's really just not maintainable. So again, the biggest thing, if you're at this stage, just trust me when I say you're super lucky, and you can kind of pave that path forward and not have to really worry about a lot of headaches at this point. So collaborate early is really like the biggest pro tip that I can get. However, if you're like me at this point, you didn't really have that option in order to get there. Those silos already existed. So let's kind of dig into the biggest part of my presentation here, and that's actually working on breaking down that silo. So I actually view this as really a 4-step process in order to remediate the silo being created. It's very important to remember that these steps are going to take a lot of time. I was actually talking with one of my coworkers yesterday when he went through my slides to look at it. He stopped at this one and kind of laughed, and he said that wow, he's like, you know, that's a very utopian view of it. And I said, I understand, and you know, it's definitely not easy to get from point A to point B because this obviously is going to take a lot of time. But these are steps that you can take in order to break down that silo and remediate it. The biggest thing in order to remember is that you really just have to start somewhere, and you have to start tackling it, or else nothing is going to get fixed. So let's start breaking these down step by step. So step one, just like any issue, is really recognizing that a problem exists. So silos are never a good thing, obviously, because they really generate a single source of knowledge. And as a company's AWS footprint grows, this causes a lot of stress on that single support team if that happens. For example, there's more for that team in order to learn and understand. And generally, they're constantly working on high impact and high visibility projects, because the cloud is hip, right? So a lot of the initial projects that are working in AWS, management is really kind of watching over it closely and making sure that everything is there, and that adds a lot of stress to the support team. There's also a ton in order to learn when you start your AWS journey. And a single team will have to pick up potentially CI/CD, infrastructure as code, monitoring, cloud security, and all of that. And then at the end of the day, that team actually might be referred to as the dreaded bottleneck, because they don't have enough resources in order to help out, or they don't have enough resource to support all the projects that actually exist. And realistically at this time, your engineers really know a very lucrative tool that if they do become too stressed, you actually risk the chance of losing them to another company because they don't want to actually deal with that. So again, the biggest part here is really to recognize that a problem exists. The second step is to establish a transition agreement. This is extremely important because defunding needs to happen and have buy-in from both sides. You need to have buy-in from the transitioning team, so that original team that we were talking about, and also the accepting team. If you don't have that, it makes it very difficult for management in order to plan out, do quarterly planning or do project planning, because right now, at this point now, they don't have 40 hours a week per engineer to work with, or 50 hours a week, or whatever they might be budgeting for. This is actually going to take time, and they have to put effort into that, and they have to take that time into consideration when performing their project plans. Step 3, I would say, is actually the most important. So again, and I would definitely stress here as well, it's very important on both sides, the receiving team and the transitioning team. The transitioning team really needs time in order to work on documentation, knowledge transfer sessions, and the presentations that are actually going to be required for that. The accepting team that is going to be taking on these new resources really needs to have time built in because they're going to be supporting now a small component of AWS, but they're going to have to know those AWS fundamentals in order to do so. An example of this is if you're going to transition RDS over to your DBAs. That's not just saying, hey, DBA team, you have another Postgres instance in order to manage, or you have another MySQL instance in order to manage. In order to get all those to work, you have to know IAM components, you have to know how S3 backups work, security groups, CloudWatch, how your VPC configuration is done. So it's actually starting to touch a lot of additional components that team might not have had to deal with in the past. That also might require like different teams learning infrastructure as code components like Terraform or CloudFormation or CDK, or CI/CD pipelines, or so on from there. It's also very important in order to stress and tell your team in order to pursue things like AWS certifications, attend webinars, attend events like this AWS Community Day in order to learn and grow, because there is a lot of additional information to learn when these components are being transitioned over to them. So once this transition is finally completed, which again I will stress is not going to happen overnight, now these new responsibilities have to be enforced. And again, this sounds very intuitive, and this sounds very matter of fact, but this one is actually very important. Because if you go back to my previous example of having a project team spun up where they were working on like the first AWS components at the company, they're gonna have contacts in the architecture organization that they worked with on that project, and they will potentially go back to them and ask questions. If these new responsibilities are not enforced by saying things like, hey, RDS is now supported by the DBAs, then you still have that silo, and you're not really getting closer to breaking that down. So it's very important in order to enforce these new responsibilities. So once that component is completed, then your tech team will look like this. Look how many smiles are in that circle, and they have disseminated knowledge of AWS within the organization, and everybody works perfectly happy. Again, I say that a little bit as a joke because obviously this is going to take a lot of time in order to get there, but you just have to take a first step in that approach, and you'll be able to break down that silo. So with that being said, that actually wraps up my talk for today. Just because this was a quick lightning talk, we don't really have time for questions at this time, but I will be available in Slack answering questions if anybody has questions, or if you want to share an experience. I'm more than happy in order to hear those experiences. If there's a lot of discussion, we can always start up an additional Slack channel as well, or a Slack room, and we can start keep the discussion going there. So with that being said, thank you again. I hope your Midwest Community Day has started out great, and I wish you the best of the luck for the rest of your day. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Bob. That was fantastic. So next up for a lightning talk, we've got Wallace. Wallace, are you able to show your screen and you're all good to go?
Yep, I'm all set to go. You should be seeing it in just 1 second. How's that look?
Looks great.
Awesome. Hey, thank you, everybody. And it's great to be part of this community event. These are really great. I am going to skip a long intro, self-intro, but I want to say I'm very passionate about debugging. I think it's extremely important. I've been involved in it for about 4 decades, both debugging my code and also enterprise code when there's some major event or some security event where you actually have to dive into the code, fire up the debugger, and take a deep look at things. So also in 2018, the good folks at the Serverless Framework, they did a survey. And one of the survey results questions was asking about challenges when it comes to serverless. And debugging was on the top of the list, along with monitoring and testing. And that really points to some weaknesses in developer tools. And people just weren't able to find ways to debug. And so for today, we're going to go over some quick points in this lightning talk. First of all, serverless is about low or no code solutions. AWS Lambda debugging, this is my opinion. There might be some people who think differently. But I think it's really moved backwards. We've gone a step backwards from being able to step through code. The concept of remote debugging has been around for decades. I remember back in the 80s, you could remote debug most languages with most IDEs. Debugging in the actual AWS Lambda runtime using your IDE is optimal. It's great for learning. It's great for finding those very difficult to find bugs that we might run into. And my last big point, and I hope there's some AWS developer advocates still around, but I think AWS can make it easier for us all if they provided some hooks. So my serverless story, I did some refresher training about 5 years ago. Even in a leadership role, it's great to be involved in learning about the latest technologies so your team, when you hear their problems, you can be up to date with what's going on. The team I was responsible for, we had scripts in 10 different regions. They were running on a EC2 instances, ran very well. It always bothered me that there's even on a micro instance, there's 95% utilization still available. And so I remembered from the refresher training this AWS Lambda thing, and we migrated the scripts to that. Things went pretty well until we ran into some bugs, some issues. It was new to us, and we experienced what I call the what the F string moment when trying to debug. If you're a Python programmer, you know about F strings. But anyway, we found out there's really nothing out there to help us debug. And so what I do, I turned to my search engine, tried to find debugging tools. I kept coming up with observability tools. On the top of the list, a company called IOPipe was relatively new. They obviously had good search engine optimization. And so that kept popping up. And finally I bit. I looked at their technology and did a trial, got it integrated with my scripts. And it was very interesting. It provided me additional visibility, but it wasn't true debugging. If you don't know, IOPipe was acquired by New Relic, which is one of the sponsors. And so a big shout out to my friends at IOPipe. But observability tools are very good and definitely essential. But to me, it really wasn't true debugging. I needed to be able to step through my code, inspect data, modify data, look at service calls, and do things that you would normally do with traditional debugging. So what did I find? Well, I read a lot of books. I read a lot of articles about debugging. And some of the books, they had chapters on debugging. And they says, well, use prints or console.log statements. I said, okay, really? It's 2018 to 2019 and now 2020 doing print and console log statements. Yeah, that works, but that's not too sophisticated. CloudWatch logs, those are useful. It's very good to be able to see what's happened, but they're much after the fact. And going through those is a tedious effort. The observability tools help, but you still have to go through a lot of log data to find what you're looking for. X-ray is excellent. It gives you a good visual representation, but again, it's not true debugging. And so what emerged at first I saw was local debugging. A lot of vendors, including AWS, were promoting local debugging solutions. So now all of a sudden you're installing infrastructure locally to emulate AWS services. If you think about that, that's sort of an anti-pattern for doing serverless development, because now you're deploying more technical debt, if you will, from somebody else to do your debugging. You're having to maintain and keep pace with Amazon's rapidly changing services, and it's another point to manage. If you're in a large enterprise, if you think about if you have hundreds of developers, each one of them is having to manage that local debugging space. So although it works well, it's not bad. It's nothing like debugging in the actual environment. Plus, you still end up with that, well, it worked on my machine, because if you're debugging locally, it's not the same as the AWS Lambda runtime, and there's nothing like actually doing it on the real thing. But in the last 2 years, there are some emerging remote debugging techniques coming out. Trek 10 was one of the first that published an article in September 2017 that was a proof of concept of how remote debugging could work. Our company, SlapForge, we released it on our own technology last July. Another company called Thundra, they released it or announced it in November of 2019. I think it went generally available in February 2020. So these techniques are emerging, which is really good. So what's the problem? Why is this so much of a challenge? Well, in traditional remote debugging, we have our trusty laptop, we have our remote Node, in this case, Node.js application, and we can create a WebSocket connection because we know the host and perhaps the IP address, and life is good. Most IDEs have the capability to support remote debugging just like this. Nothing else is needed. Life is good. You can do your remote debugging all day long. But then we jump to Lambda. So we still have our trusty laptop, our favorite IDE, and we try to do a WebSocket connection. And guess what? Because everything is abstracted away from us in the AWS Lambda function, which is by design, we don't know the host name, we don't know the IP. This is really where the wheels fall off, where IDEs just cannot reach those AWS Lambda functions in the true runtime. So if you look at this slide, this is really what I call the money slide, because this is sort of based on the Trek 10 solution, where you can create a path to actually go from your IDE to the true Lambda function running in the runtime. You have on the left your trusty laptop. It has a local client, and that local client is handling all the protocol exchanges between your IDE, just like it was contacting or communicating with a remote host. But then that local client connects to, via secure authenticated channel, up to a debug server. In our case, we call it the SlapForge debug server. And that essentially just brokers the communication between the local client and that debug server. Now on the right side, lower right side, you have your Lambda function. And below that, there's in our case, called a SlapForge debug layer. And those two communicate so that anything that's coming across from that broker server, they can talk back and forth. And so any of the command and control that happens from the left side, from the local IDE, can be transferred over through the magic of networking and be able to actually step through and stop your function. Now you're thinking, okay, my functions have a maximum execution time of 5 seconds. Well, yeah, you definitely need to extend that. We recommend anywhere from 2 to 5 minutes. And if you think about it, debug sessions, you're not doing as frequently as normal executions. So you're not really running up your AWS Lambda bill. Plus it gives you a chance to stop the function. And it's quite amazing when you see it in action. At the end of the presentation, I do have a QR code where you can go to our website to see full videos of this in action, because it truly is amazing to be able to be working on an actual AWS Lambda function, stop its execution, inspect variables, modify data, look at service calls, do what you do normally in traditional debugging. So vendors with AWS Lambda remote debugging solutions, of course, we have our company, SlapForge. We're a very small startup. With our own product, we went generally available in 2019. More recently, we support Java and Node.js on a number of IDEs. Most of them are ones you probably already use. Thundra, they went generally available in February 2020. They support Java, Node, and Python with, again, all the popular IDEs. Another company called Rookout, they have what's called a Rookout sandbox, and I haven't really been able to tell much about, if they truly support remote debugging. I included them as another vendor to possibly look at. Trek 10, I'd definitely like to give them a shout out. The link there, encourage you to download the presentations, because copying these even shortened links is a challenge. But look at their proof of concept paper. This was in 2017. So if any vendors are saying, we're first to market with this, I really would say Trek 10 was the first to put it out there that remote debugging is possible with AWS Lambda functions. So what can AWS do to help us out? First of all, it'd be great to have them recognize that live remote debugging is essential. Being able to work in the actual Lambda runtime is a great learning experience. It's a great way to find trouble. If you run into those difficult to find bugs, they could provide an integration to support remote debugging. This is where the developer advocates, we've talked to a few of them, they're extremely busy people. Getting a developer advocate like Chris Munn's or James Beswick's time, I mean, there's people pulling on them all the time. But if you can talk to your local developer advocate, if you're interested in remote debugging and what they could do, by all means, drop a bug in their ear, no pun intended, and maybe they'll show some interest. I give them a jump start. Here's some service names to consider. I came from a big organization, and always the first step is, what are we going to call this? Simple debugging service, Lambda debugging service, dynamic debugging service. My first debugger, and this will date me, was called the dynamic debugging tool, and that was released by Digital Research in 1978. So, debugging technologies have been around a long time. Corey Quinn, if you don't know him, he gives a lot of snarky comments about AWS services. I might poll him after this for a AWS debugging service name. So in summary, serverless development is all about low or no code solutions. If you're having to deploy technology to do local debugging for serverless, stop right there and think about that. Is that really what you want to do? Take on more technical debt so you can do serverless, because we're really trying to have low or no code solutions. Your favorite IDE can probably handle remote debugging now. And if you look at our site, and if you want to look at the competition site, Thundra, they have, all of us have good guidance on how to perform remote debugging. And the first time you see it and you get it working, I mean, it's truly magical to be able to stop an executing Lambda function. And my last point, AWS, definitely any developer advocates that want to talk to us, we'll give them all the time that they can spend, because we really think it's important. And it's really the right way to be doing debugging, because going through logs, doing indirect methods, I mean, that's just going a step backwards. The QR code there is for more information. My contact information is below. By all means, put questions out on the Slack channel. We'll be watching that. I have another co-founder that's online, and he'll help with any answers for any extreme technical questions. But really, thank you for your time today.
Thanks so much, Wallace. We do have a little bit of extra time here. Our next session is 11:45. If you and Bob are up for it, I can open both of your mics for Q&A. And then it also looks like, I put you on the spot, Randall, but it looks like you're still around as well, if there's any of that you wanted to respond to. So Bob, hang in there for a second. I'm going to open your mic up. All right, do we have any questions? And you could just raise your hand on the app, by the way.
I have a question for Randall. How's he feel about remote debugging?
Oh, let's see, here we go. All right, Randall, you should be open to talk now.
Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. I fully 100% agree with you. I'm actually going to connect you with Chris Munns after this. One of the things that, are you familiar with ngrok?
No, I'm not personally.
ngrok is a tool that lets you take a local hosted web service just on your laptop, and it provides a public endpoint with HTTPS and all that. I think there's definitely room for a tool like ngrok, but for Lambda, where you open up a TCP control session and you say, hey, I want to have this run in the Lambda integration environment, and I want to be able to step through it and interactively, it's almost like Lambda is going to be a shim for running your local code. I think that's the way you can debug quickly and iteratively. So that's what I would like to see. And I've been asking for that for a couple of years. So I'm going to connect you with some people, and hopefully we can get this done.
Yeah, we know Chris Munns, and it's really hard to get his attention because he's so busy. So if we could just get a few minutes of his time, we'd like to talk more with him.
Will do. I'll make it happen.